My name is Courtney. I'm 32 years old, and 5 hours before everything broke open, I was still on the highway telling myself this dinner would be like every other family dinner I had survived. I would show up, smile at the right moments, help with whatever needed doing, and leave before I let myself expect anything different. The second I walked through the front door, a stack of plates was pressed into my hands before I had even set my bag down, and I was told my sister's boyfriend would be there any minute, so I needed to stay useful and stay out of the way. That was not new. In my family, I was never the daughter anyone prepared the room for. I was the one who made the room ready for someone else. I carried the plates into the dining room, straightened napkins, checked glasses, adjusted chairs, and listened to the kind of conversation that happens around you when people have already decided what your role is. The evening had barely started, and I was already being treated less like family and more like hired help in my own parents' house. I should have left then. I know that now. But I stayed because some habits take years to break, and because part of me still wanted to believe I could sit at that table without disappearing into it. Then he arrived, stepped inside, looked straight at me, and stopped cold like he knew exactly who I was, which made my stomach drop for reasons I could not explain yet, because whatever he recognized was not supposed to follow me into that house. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? Where are you watching from? And what's the weather like where you are? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. My older sister Jillian has always been the center of that house in ways that are hard to explain to people who have never lived inside a family like mine. She did not need to ask for attention because attention was already arranged around her before she walked into a room. My parents prepared for her the way other people prepare for honored company, smoothing everything out, checking small details, deciding what version of themselves they wanted reflected back. I was never the reason the room changed. I was usually part of the work that made it look right. That difference sounds small until you have spent enough years inside it to recognize it before anyone says a word. My father, Mark, likes order, presentation, and anything that can be held up as proof that a life is going well. He respects jobs with titles that sound solid when repeated to friends, the kind that make him lean back a little and act as if he had something to do with the success himself. Jillian learned that language early. She knows how to talk about plans, upgrades, connections, and future steps in a way that makes him feel understood. And he has rewarded that for so long that now he does it without thinking. My mother, Denise, is different. My father decides what matters, and my mother arranges the house around it. She would never say out loud that one daughter gets admiration while the other gets assigned whatever is left over, but that is how it works in practice. She hands me the practical things, the messy things, the invisible things, then hands Jillian the freedom to move through the evening untouched by any of it. If you asked my mother to explain herself, she would probably call me dependable, maybe even say she trusts me more, and that would sound generous to anyone who was not paying attention to where that trust always leads. It leads to me carrying something while my sister walks in with empty hands. That night was built the same way. My coat was still over the back of a chair when my mother sent me to the kitchen for serving spoons, then to the dining room for water glasses, then to the hall closet for the folding chair she only brought out when she wanted the table to feel fuller and more important. My father stood near the dining room entrance and checked everything with the cool, appraising look he uses when someone else has done the work, and he is deciding whether it meets his standards. The plates had to match. The napkins had to be folded the way my mother likes them when she is trying to impress people. The good stemware came out, which was not something they ever bothered with when it was only me coming by for dinner. Favoritism changes shape when it lasts long enough. It stops looking dramatic and starts looking normal. The person receiving it no longer has to ask for it, and the person living outside it begins measuring the evening in smaller ways. Who gets the better seat? Who gets asked real questions? Who gets listened to all the way through? I work at a hospital as a victim advocate. Most people outside that world do not know exactly what the job involves, which has made it easy for my family to reduce it into something smaller than it is. I help people in the first hours after something in their life has gone badly wrong. I sit with them while they make decisions they never expected to make, explain paperwork, options, phone calls, reports, follow-up care, and what safety has to look like when someone has spent too long without it. Some nights, I leave feeling like I have been carrying the weight of several lives with both hands. My parents hear the word advocate and sort it into one of those vague categories they use for work they do not respect. My father once described it as the kind of position people take before they figure out what they really want, and my mother nodded as if that settled the matter. I stopped correcting them after that. Not because I agreed with them, but because there is a point where being unseen becomes its own kind of exhaustion. I carried a tray of glasses into the dining room and saw the table laid out in the shape of the evening my parents wanted. My sister's place was obvious before she even sat down. The chair beside hers had been pulled slightly farther out than the others, ready for the man she was bringing home. My father's chair faced the center of the room like a command post. My mother's place sat where she could keep track of everything without appearing to. Mine was at the far end, closest to the kitchen doorway, where I have sat for years because it makes it easier to get up when someone needs something. Nobody has assigned me that seat out loud in a very long time. They do not need to. I remember looking at that table and feeling the old tiredness settle in before the night had even properly begun. Not anger? Not yet. Something flatter than that. I set down the tray, straightened one crooked fork, and listened to my parents moving through the house with the restless energy they save for important company. Then I heard my sister's voice from the front walk, bright and pleased with itself, and the whole house seemed to tighten around the moment she was about to step inside. By the time we all moved toward the front of the house, I had already slipped back into the role I knew best, staying useful, staying quiet, making myself part of the machinery of the evening instead of a person inside it. Jillian came through the door first with the easy confidence she wore whenever she knew she was being watched, and the man beside her looked exactly like someone my parents would approve of before he had even said a word. My mother hugged Jillian, then turned all of that polished warmth toward him. My father stepped forward with his hand out, and that careful smile he saves for men he might want to respect. I stayed a few feet back near the dining room, with a stack of napkins still in my hands, watching from the edge the way I always did. Then he looked past them and saw me. The change in his face was small, but it was real. He did not say my name. He just stopped for half a second too long, like the room had shifted under him. It was the kind of pause most people would miss unless they were the reason for it. I was. He knew me. I could tell immediately, and the certainty of that hit before I could make sense of where from. I had seen too many people in hospital rooms, waiting areas, crisis intake offices, and overnight consult spaces to place every face on site. Sometimes people remembered me because I had stayed with them during the worst stretch of a night they thought would never end. Sometimes I remembered them only later, when one detail returned and everything around it snapped into place. He covered the pause well. He smiled, shook my father's hand, thanked my mother for having him over, and let Jillian guide him inside as if nothing unusual had happened. But I had seen it. Whatever version of him my sister had been describing for weeks, the calm boyfriend with the good job and the serious intentions, that version had not expected to find me standing in my parents' dining room holding linen napkins like staff. My sister introduced him to the room as Garrett. The sound of his name did not help me place him yet, but it stayed with me. He greeted me last because I was standing furthest away, which somehow felt fitting. Jillian turned toward me with the kind of brightness people use when they are performing family harmony for an audience and said my name like she was remembering to include me at the last possible moment. Garrett faced me fully then. He held out his hand, and when I took it, his grip tightened for one brief second, like he was confirming something to himself. He said it was good to see me again. Not meet me, see me again. The words were quiet, but I heard them clearly. I do not know whether anyone else did. My parents did not react, and Jillian moved on too quickly to notice. I did not ask where he knew me from because suddenly I understood that he was choosing not to explain it in front of them. That meant the connection was real, and whatever he remembered had enough weight that he did not want to unfold it casually between the good glasses and my mother's folded napkins. That realization stayed with me while everyone drifted toward the living room with drinks. My mother asked me to bring in another bottle of sparkling water. My father wanted the ice bucket moved from the kitchen counter to the sideboard. Jillian had already taken the center of the room and started telling a story about a weekend trip she and Garrett had taken, and people laughed in the right places. Garrett smiled when expected, but even from across the room I could feel that part of his attention stayed on me. Not enough for anyone else to call it out. Just enough that every time I crossed through the room with glasses or refilled something at the sideboard, I caught him noticing. I kept trying to place him. A man outside an exam bay, someone under bad hospital lighting while paperwork printed down the hall. My work brings me into contact with people at the point where fear strips all the extra polish off them. Seeing someone later, dressed well, rested, standing in a brightly lit living room with my sister's hand on his arm, can make memory feel slippery for a while. Still, something about him tugged at me. It was not just his face. It was the way he was reading the room, taking in who moved easily and who moved because they were expected to. My mother called me back into the kitchen and handed me the salad bowl with a list of small instructions that sounded less like a request and more like a reminder of my place in the evening. When I stepped out again, Garrett had shifted away from the middle of the room. His eyes met mine, then moved to my parents, then back to me. Something in his face tightened. Recognition layered over judgment, and not of me. That was when I understood the evening had changed shape, whether anyone else knew it yet or not. Dinner settled into the kind of rhythm my family always mistakes for closeness, the easy clink of silverware, the small pauses after polite questions, the steady exchange of stories that circle the same approved subjects every time we sit down together. I took my place at the far end of the table near the kitchen doorway, exactly where I had known I would end up, while Jillian sat in the center beside Garrett, as if the entire meal had been arranged to frame her correctly from every angle. My father, Mark, did most of the talking at first. He asked Garrett about work, about the size of the company, about where he saw things going over the next few years, and he listened with the kind of attention I have spent most of my life trying and failing to earn from him. My mother, Denise, kept the meal moving with the soft efficiency she uses when she wants an evening to look effortless, though I noticed she never once reached for a serving dish herself, when I was sitting right there within arm's reach of the kitchen. Jillian added details about restaurants, weekend plans, mutual friends, and the kind of social calendar that sounds more impressive the more casually it is delivered. Every part of the table moved toward her. Even the silences made room for her. I have learned over the years that favoritism does not always look like obvious praise. Sometimes it looks like being fully received. A person speaks, and everyone waits for the end of the sentence. A person laughs, and the room follows. A person mentions a possibility, and suddenly it becomes a topic worth exploring. That is what my sister has always had in that house. The rest of us were expected to orbit around it. I ate slowly and said very little, which was normal for those dinners, not because I had nothing to say, But because I knew how quickly anything that belonged to me could be reduced into something smaller before it reached the other end of the table. Garrett noticed more than I wanted him to. Every time my mother asked for something without quite asking, his eyes lifted. When I stood to bring in the bread basket, he watched. When my father asked me to check whether there was more dressing in the kitchen, he watched that too. He was careful not to make his reaction obvious, but by then I could see he was tracking the same pattern I had been living inside for years. My aunt, who had arrived late and missed most of the setup, turned toward me midway through dinner and asked the kind of ordinary question that only feels ordinary if you have never had someone else answer it for you. She asked what I had been busy with lately. I barely had time to look up before my father stepped in. He said I was still doing hospital support work, said it in a tone that suggested a temporary arrangement, the sort of thing people do while they sort themselves out. My mother added that I was good with people in difficult situations, as if kindness were the whole job, as if long shifts, legal paperwork, emergency coordination, safety planning, discharge protocols, follow-up calls, and hours spent holding frightened lives together with your voice and your patience were all just an extension of having a gentle personality. Then Jillian smiled into her wineglass and said, I had always been the emotional one in the family. The table let that comment pass as if it were harmless. That was the part that almost got me, not the dismissal itself, but how familiar it was to everyone else. My work was reduced in less than 10 seconds, and nobody at that table except Garrett seemed to hear the insult hidden inside the summary. He had gone still by then, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed because I had been trying not to notice him all evening. My father moved on as if he had settled the matter, returning the conversation to Garrett, to growth, investment, expansion, and the language he trusts, because numbers sound more serious to him than damage and recovery ever will. My mother nodded along. Jillian went back to smiling the way people do when they believe the night is still under control. Around us, forks kept lifting, glasses kept touching the table, and a cousin at the far side asked Garrett about golf courses in Scottsdale as if nothing important had just happened. That almost made it worse. The entire room was participating in the same old family habit of stepping around whatever made anyone uncomfortable, and for one sharp second I could see my own life the way a stranger might, flattened at the edges so the picture in the middle stayed attractive. I looked down at my plate and moved a piece of chicken through the sauce without taking a bite, because suddenly I understood that Garrett had not simply recognized me from somewhere. He knew enough about my work to hear exactly what my family was doing to it, and once I realized that, the entire table felt unsteady in a way it had not a minute earlier. What broke the rhythm of the meal was not anger, at least not at first. It was precision. Garrett set his fork down, folded his hands once like he was deciding how careful to be, and then looked directly at my father with the expression of someone who had reached the limit of what he was willing to let slide in front of him. He asked whether my parents actually knew what I did at the hospital, or whether they preferred the version of it that made them more comfortable. The room quieted so quickly it felt rehearsed. My father gave a small, dismissive smile, the one he uses when he thinks a younger man is about to overstep and can still be corrected by tone alone. He started to explain that he understood the broad outline well enough. Garrett did not raise his voice. He simply said that broad outlines were exactly how people erase the hardest work someone does. Then he turned slightly toward the rest of the table and said he knew that because my work had mattered to his family on one of the worst nights of their lives. No one spoke after that. Even Jillian seemed to realize the evening had gone somewhere she could no longer manage with charm. Garrett said his younger sister's name was Elaine, and that, months earlier, she had arrived at the hospital after leaving a relationship that had become dangerous enough that leaving did not immediately make her safe. He said the first hours after that were chaos, fear, paperwork, unanswered questions, and the kind of exhaustion that makes even simple choices feel impossible. He said I was the person who met them in that state. Not a nurse doing rounds, Not a volunteer passing through. Not a nice woman with a soft voice who made the waiting room easier for an hour, but the person who sat with his sister and explained what the hospital could do, what the police report might mean, what protective options existed, where she could go that night, how follow-up care worked, what evidence needed to be preserved, and what not to do if panic made her want to disappear before the process was finished. He spoke with the flat control people use when they are trying very hard not to let memory take over their face. He said Elaine had trusted me before she trusted anyone else in that building, because I never once acted like her fear was inconvenient, and that their mother had been close to falling apart in the hallway until I pulled her into an empty consultation room, got water into her hands, slowed everything down into steps, and made the whole situation feel survivable, one decision at a time. I sat completely still while he spoke because if I moved, every eye at that table would have followed it. My mother's expression had changed first. Her posture stayed composed, but something behind her eyes lost its certainty. My father looked less offended than confused, as if he could not reconcile the daughter he had filed away under useful but unimpressive with the woman being described in front of him now. Jillian stared at Garrett with a kind of fixed disbelief that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the fact that he was no longer performing the role she had brought him there to play. Garrett kept going, and the more calmly he spoke, the worse it landed. He said the reason he recognized me at the door was because people do not forget the face of the person who stood with their family while everything was unstable and frightening, and no one knew what the next hour was going to look like. He said I had stayed well past the point where most people would have handed the case to someone else, and he knew that because every time he thought the conversation was over, I was still there finding another number to call, another form to explain, another answer that kept his sister from feeling abandoned in a system built to overwhelm people who are already in shock. He said that when families are frightened, they remember exactly who treated them like human beings and who talked around them as if they were one more file to process before sunrise. Nobody interrupted him. My father looked down at the tablecloth. My mother's hand flattened over the stem of her glass without lifting it. My aunt glanced at me, then away, the way people do when they realize too late that they have been sitting inside someone else's humiliation without naming it. Garrett finally turned back toward my parents and said the hardest part of the night for him had not been walking into a formal dinner for the first time. It had been hearing my life translated into something small by the people who should have known better. He said it quietly, which gave the sentence nowhere to hide. The silence after that was not awkward in the ordinary sense. It was exposure. The room had lost the version of me my family preferred, and there was no easy way to put it back. The rest of dinner moved forward only because no one knew how to stop it without admitting what had just happened. Plates emptied by degrees, water glasses sweated onto the table. Someone asked a strained question about traffic on the freeway and got an answer that died halfway through. My mother tried once to restart the old rhythm by offering more salad, but even that sounded wrong now. Too light for the room we were actually sitting in. I stayed where I was and let the silence settle wherever it wanted. For years, I had been the person who saved these dinners from discomfort, the one who stood up first, cleared the dishes before anyone had to sit too long with themselves, gave the room another task so no one had to look directly at what had been said. That reflex was still in me when the meal finally reached its natural end. My mother glanced toward me automatically, not sharply, not rudely, just with the expectation that I would rise and begin. That was how deeply the role had been built into our family. She did not even have to ask anymore. My body almost answered before my mind did. I looked at the stack of plates nearest me, then at the kitchen doorway a few feet away, then at my mother, and for the first time in my adult life, I did not move to make the room comfortable. I picked up my napkin, folded it once, and set it beside my plate. The gesture was small, but everybody saw it. No one reached for a dish. My father looked at me as though the mechanics of the evening had failed in some personal way. Jillian's face tightened first with embarrassment, then with anger, because by then she understood that nothing about the night was coming back under her control. My mother said my name in a low, warning tone that belonged to another era of our family, one where I still mistook obedience for peace. I met her eyes and told her I was not doing this anymore. That was all. One sentence. No speech. No performance. No attempt to gather up 20 years of being diminished into a single dramatic moment. I did not need one. The table already held the evidence. My father asked what that was supposed to mean, and I turned toward him because for once I wanted the answer to land exactly where it belonged. I told him the problem had never been that they did not understand my work. The problem was that they had never cared enough to understand me. I said it evenly, which made it harder to dismiss. My mother began to say my name again, softer this time, as if she could pull me back by lowering her voice, but that had never actually worked. Jillian demanded to know why I had to make the night about myself, and hearing that from her almost made me laugh because there was something astonishing about being treated like household staff for years and then being accused of selfishness the first time you refused to keep serving. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked out of the dining room before anyone could drag me into the kind of argument that feeds on repetition and ends by protecting the people who started it. The hallway felt cooler than the dining room, and by the time I reached the front door, my hands were steady. I grabbed my bag from the chair where I had dropped it when I came in and stepped outside into the dry Phoenix night. The air smelled like gravel, heat, and watered landscaping. The usual suburban mix that had once felt like home and now just felt familiar. I heard the front door open behind me a few seconds later and knew before I turned that it would be Garrett. He stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to speak without forcing me into company. He said he was sorry for saying any of it at the table if it had made things harder for me, and I told him the hard part had never been the truth. The hard part had been living with people who needed it made smaller before they could tolerate it. He nodded like that answer fit something he had already guessed. There was a pause. Not awkward, just honest. And then he said he could not stay inside that house and pretend he had not seen what he had seen. I told him that was his decision to make, not mine, because I was done making choices that protected other people from the consequences of their own behavior. Inside the house, I could hear muffled voices rising and falling without distinct words, the sound of a family trying to restore order after the truth had already rearranged the furniture of the night. We stood there for another moment under the porch light, two people who knew each other from a very different kind of night, and then I walked to my car, got in, and left my parents' house without looking back. In the weeks that followed, the consequences arrived in the plain, practical ways real consequences usually do. Nothing exploded, nobody transformed overnight, and my family did not suddenly develop the kind of self-awareness people in stories like to mistake for redemption. What changed was simpler than that, and far more permanent. Garrett ended things with Jillian not long after that dinner, and from what little I heard through extended family, he did it without drama. He did not accuse her of ruining his life, or turn their breakup into some theatrical punishment. He simply refused to keep building a future with someone who could sit comfortably inside a family arrangement that treated another person like background labor and call it normal. That, more than anything else, unsettled my parents. They could explain anger. They could defend a misunderstanding. They could tell themselves I had always been too sensitive, too quiet, too difficult to read. What they could not explain away was a man they had wanted to impress deciding, after one evening in their house, that he had seen enough. My mother texted me first. The message was careful, restrained, almost businesslike. She said the dinner had gotten out of hand, and that families sometimes say things imperfectly under pressure. She said Jillian was devastated, my father was upset, and I should not make any permanent decisions based on one bad night. I read it once and understood immediately that she still believed the problem was the scene, not the structure that created it. She was trying to contain fallout, not confront truth. I did not reply. My father called 2 days later and left a voicemail that sounded less like an apology than a man attempting to restore order without ever naming what had been disordered. He said he did not appreciate being embarrassed in his own home, then softened the ending by saying we should all sit down soon and talk like adults. That was the moment I knew there would be no version of reconciliation worth having. A real conversation would have started in a different place. It would have begun with recognition, not self-protection. It would have sounded less like damage control and more like accountability. Instead, even after everything, he was still framing the worst part of the evening as his discomfort. Jillian reached out last, and somehow hers was the easiest message to understand because it was the most honest in its selfishness. She did not ask how I was. She did not mention my work, Garrett's words, or anything that had happened at that table except the effect it had on her life. She wanted to know why I had chosen that night to stop playing along, why I had let things become so awkward, why I had not helped smooth things over once Garrett started talking. Reading her message felt like seeing our entire relationship in one sharp, efficient paragraph. She had mistaken my silence for support for so long that the first time I withheld it, she experienced it as betrayal. I blocked her number after that. Then I blocked my mother's. I left my father's unblocked for 1 week out of habit more than hope. Listened to 2 more voicemails that circled the same points without ever reaching the center, and blocked his number too. After that, the silence was not lonely. It was clean. People who have never had to cut off family like to imagine it as one grand emotional act, a slammed door, a speech, a final declaration that shakes the whole foundation of a life. For me, it was administrative before it was dramatic. I changed my emergency contact. I updated paperwork. I stopped checking my phone with that small reflexive dread I had carried for years every time a family holiday got close. When Thanksgiving came around, I signed up to work part of the day and spent the evening with coworkers who understood what it meant to build peace out of smaller choices. When Christmas approached, I did not negotiate, explain, or leave room for guilt to re-enter through politeness. I stayed home, ordered takeout, turned off my phone, and discovered that a quiet day can feel more like belonging than a decorated house ever did when the people inside it only valued what you could carry for them. News about my family still reached me in fragments because families never stop talking even when they stop speaking to one person directly. Jillian moved through the months after the breakup angry at first, then embarrassed, then defensive in the way people become when they realize a story they had arranged around themselves no longer holds. My parents started hosting fewer elaborate dinners, without me there to absorb the invisible work before, during, and after. They learned what I had always known, which was that comfort looks effortless only when someone else is paying for it with their energy. I do not say that with satisfaction. I say it because it is true. Losing access to the person who quietly made everything easier is a consequence, even if the people who created it would prefer to call it distance, stubbornness, or a misunderstanding that went too far. The strangest part was how calm I became once I stopped trying to earn a place that had never really been offered. I slept better. I felt lighter driving home after long shifts because I no longer had a second life waiting on the other side of my phone, one where I was expected to shrink on command so other people could keep feeling large. At work, I kept doing what I had always done. I sat with frightened people in bright hospital rooms and dull consultation spaces and helped them make decisions when panic wanted to make the decisions for them. The difference was that I had finally taken some of my own advice. Safety is not only about leaving danger. Sometimes it is about refusing to keep returning to places that require your silence in exchange for temporary inclusion. Family can be blood, history, obligation, memory, and still not be safe. Love can be claimed loudly and practiced poorly. Being useful is not the same thing as being valued, and being needed is not the same thing as being known. That was the lesson I carried out of my parents' house and into the rest of my life. If this story leaves anything with you, I hope it is that you do not owe lifelong access to people who only recognize your worth when someone outside the family says it out loud. Sometimes the healthiest ending is the one with no reunion in it. Sometimes peace begins the moment you stop volunteering to disappear. Thank you for listening to my story. If any part of it stayed with you, I'd love to know what you think, and wherever you are, I hope you are building a life where you are seen clearly and treated like you belong.